Judith White, for this exhibition, River Stories, what is your connection with the river? What was the visual and emotional starting point?
As generally a symbol of personal humanity, I suppose, being part of the big picture as well as being an individual. And the river represents an environment that is organic and natural and has a sense of time. That's the other thing too, like a river will move through an environment, so it has a chronological time frame that could be parallel to a human life, but at the same time is connected with other things like land, rocks, trees, human beings, so it's just an element within nature that has all of these other overriding historical and philosophical and poetic connections.
You mentioned that you did workshops with people who live by the river.
As a way of making them feel more spiritually connected, I mean, the exhibition here at the Maitland Gallery is focusing fairly heavily on the idea of environmental issues and river degradation and very important issues, but I think sometimes that if people don't have a personal spiritual connection with where they live, it's their backyard, you're not really going to convince them to do much about it. And interestingly enough, a lot of the river environment, the Hunter River environment, is incredibly neglected, and there's not much in the way of open spaces for people to interact with the river. It seems to be a phenomenon that a lot of the towns literally turned their back on the river, which is probably what the exhibition is trying to redress.
So there's an element of rediscovering the river.
Yes, and celebrating it. Yeah. But on a personal level, probably for me on a more personal human level, rather than scientific or environmental.
Your pictures have figures in them.
A new departure for me, and something now that I can't not include, which is really quite spooky, because paintings before have tried to illuminate the idea of natural forces, and natural forces that are outside of even the picture plane. So the subject focus has been very closely connected with the idea of water. I suppose just as an element it fascinates me because of its volatility and also the light that's in water. I mean, light's a pretty important element of my pictures. But that sense of needing to have a human being has come primarily from feeling that I need to explain the individual, or a sense of the human content of the environment and the forces that are part of nature that affect human beings. And before I tried to explain that as being outside the picture plane and affecting just what you're looking at. For example, in the Estuary series, which I've been working on for about 15 years, things that were to do with storms, bushfires, wild tides, all of those really powerful natural elements were all explained by the debris and bits and pieces of organic matter that were in water. Now I'm really fascinated and want to continue working with the idea of actually putting people, human forms, not necessarily individuals, but just humanity into that environment and see what happens.
But in these pictures, it's a fragmented image. It's into the image, the whole image, in different ways.
Probably because I'm wanting to explain my sense of being a human being and just being part of nature. So that rocks, trees, water, people are all made up of different balances of organic matter, basically, and that's where the figures then are all sort of disembodied and reflections, and they're all sort of fragmented, and the same textures and colours are in the landscape as are in the people themselves, with a few exceptions, and that happens with the idea of that ghost element, and I find shadows really intriguing in terms of explaining the element of ghost, and that when you're alive, you cast a shadow, and that obviously you're not going to when you're no longer in that physical form. So shadows in paintings can be about people that are from the past, people who are no longer there. And probably one painting that this was a definite conscious decision was to put the shadow on one figure and not on the other, the cast shadow. And I really wanted to explain that sense of companionship that I felt when I saw these people fishing by the river, and the companionship of sharing the environment and sharing this activity that they were engaged in, but that they're obviously not maybe elderly, but there's a certain time frame, and that what I'm suggesting is perhaps the figure on the left is no longer there, and the figure on the right is remembering that companionship, and the coupleness has been changed, and the dead person is not casting a shadow on the person that is alive is. But I felt they looked like they were reminiscing, and they were sort of gazing off into the landscape. So
the companionship of fishermen.
Yeah, and also, I mean, that's part of the idea of the personal aspect of the river, the personal stories. That there's somebody that could have a completely quite introspective reaction to the environment that's to do with their own life.
And the boatman is a recurring figure.
Yeah, well, he's got a pretty potent history in myth and elsewhere, and I suppose it's slightly the symbol of death, or maybe that change from being a human being to being just a bunch of elements that are wafting around in nature. And you know, in some of the paintings, the boatman's almost inviting the person to get into the boat as a way of passage or shift from one condition to another. So it's a symbol. But also referring to the fact that people like tootling around on rivers in boats. So it's got that sort of
very
really
domestic.
nice, domestic aspect, that's a good word, as well as this sort of deep and meaningful sort of philosophical idea.